The U.S. financial sector is often thought to be a bellwether for the overall stock market. When it's one of the top performing sectors of the market, it often indicates that a sustained rally has some legs to move forward. If we take a look where we stand right now, we can see here this top graph represents the U.S. financial sector through the ETF that trades in the States, XLF. The next graph represents the performance of the financial sector relative to the S&P 500. Next graph down represents U.S. 10-year Treasury note yield. Next graph down represents the U.S. 10-year Treasury note yield minus the U.S. Treasury note on the 2-year yield on 2 years. And this represents the overall shape of the yield curve. The reason I'm actually going into the 10-year Treasury note and also to what we call the 10s and 2s, the shape of the yield curve, because this has been driving the overall financial sector. The higher the 10-year yield helps the bank's profitability, and particularly if we've got a steepening yield curve, because banks actually taking their money at the short end of the curve and lend it out at the long end of the curve. If we take, which helps their net interest margin. And looking at this graph here, these gray bars represent the 10-year yield on the Treasury notes when it's increasing, which is this graph here. So we can see here that the increases over the last year and a bit. If we take a look at the performance relative to of the financial sector relative to the S&P 500, we can see that, generally speaking, the financial sector has outperformed when the U.S. 10-year Treasury note has been going up. Now, right now, the U.S. financial sector is in its seasonal period. It finishes in mid-April. But we are starting to see some concerns here. If we look at 2018, we can see here that the U.S. Treasury note, the yield on the 10-year Treasury note, it was increasing here into February, and the financial sector was outperforming as well at the same time. And once again, we did have a steepening curve here into February as well. But interestingly enough, we did see that U.S. 10-year Treasury note turned down, the yield on the 10-year Treasury note turned down, and we saw a flattening of the curve here as well. So that while the 10-year yield was decreasing, we saw that 2-year yield starting to pop up, which basically has created this negative environment for the financial sector relative to the S&P 500. And yes, we have seen some absolute negative performance for the financial sector, but that's happened with many other sectors of the market. But what is concerning particularly is that we have seen this underperformance recently for the financial sector as we've seen the yields pull back on the 10-year yield. Anyway, obviously, we could see that pick up again, but right now that's not a trend that's taking place. So given that we're getting close to the end of the seasonal period for the financial sector, a consideration should be given to reducing position from a seasonal basis and a technical basis, or even exiting a position as well. Well, the bigger concern as well is for the overall market, because if we don't see the financial sector actually start to perform well over a sustained period of time, this rally might not last that long, even though we still are in the favorable seasonal period for both the financial sector and the overall stock market. Something to think about. Thank you.